it is I, Tantus Narvan Dracovin, Lord Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the clans and bloodlines of Vampire the Masquerade in the world of darkness. Today I'm continuing with the various clans there are, with the Fallen clan, one of the original 13 clans, the Cappadocians. They are masters of Auspex Fortitude and the Mortis version of necromancy. They were renowned scholars known to be obsessed with the soul and death, and they've been driven to extinction, or near extinction, by a coup d'etat by the Giovanni, which I've talked about previously. But the Giovanni underestimate those that have learned about death and have mastered it far more than they have. The Cappadocians weren't ended. Now, the inherent weakness of the Cappadocians is that they appear physically to have the appearance of being dead. They have the paleness of actual death to them. What this means in game terms is that when it comes to social roles, everything that they do is at +1 difficulty. Basically, it's harder for them to do anything social because they kind of look like they're dead. So when we talk about ancient days, we have to talk about the Cappadocians' antediluvian, Cappadocius. He was a scholar, a priest in life, and becoming embraced basically drove him to this interesting idea of the juxtaposition between unlife and death. He became obsessed with it and began to study it intently. This means he kept out of the politics and the ways of doing things of the other antediluvians, regardless of what was happening in both the first and second cities. So up until then, he basically kept to himself. He didn't embrace anybody. He didn't involve himself in any of their politics. He just did research. It wasn't until after the fall of the second city that things changed, when he embraced his first child, Canaris, who was there to help him study basically the mortal world in representation to the death, to basically use mortals as a studying point on death. So this was the first of 3 events which led to the actual formation of the clan. Of course, the embrace of Canaris was the actual start of the clan. Now, no longer was it just the antediluvian. He had a bloodline to him. But then were Cappadocius' first visions, basically giving him on a direction. And he supposedly met with a strange man outside of Jerusalem who told him of this nameless god, who gave him such vision and information that these 3 events combined drove to the goals of the clan and what they really wanted to do, and all the experiments and plans that they had related to this overall goal. One of the first major relations to this goal was the construction of Idiessa. I'm probably butchering that name, but it was this temple complex with massive underground tunnels that functions as the Cappadocians' headquarters. See, the Cappadocians came up with an interesting goal: to find this god they heard about and diablerize them. So that's what they want to do. The entire clan has this goal of diablerizing God. Cappadocius, as I said, was a priest in life, and in fact, when it came to learning about Christianity, he adopted many of its beliefs and formed his own version of it. He believed in that sort of religious thing, so he kept with the priesthood. Now, when we move into the Dark Ages, we saw that Cappadocius himself was vaguely involved in the clan, more than most antediluvians, but the fact is, he was a good scholar and visionary, but a terrible manager. The clan itself had very little organization. He left most of that to his childe, those that he had, his trusted few that he had. And for some time, they began to spread the clan, effectively the clan's influence. And they all were, of course, researching these idealisms of death and leading towards the ultimate goal. It wasn't until they began expanding into certain cities that Cappadocius learned that his clan of vampires, was the largest that there was, which shocked him. He didn't understand that his clan had spread so far, that it had become so numerous in number. He needed to stop this, which led to the first of the things that he did. He called a massive meeting of the entire clan and brought them together, led them deep under the temple complexes into these underground tunnels. We took each one of them individually and asked them a number of questions. If you got those questions wrong, you were basically banished to the tunnels. If not, you stayed at his side. Thousands of vampires were sealed down in those tunnels to starve, to frenzy, to feed upon each other, and eventually end up in torpor. The entire thing was cursed and sealed to keep these down in there, whatever remains, deep underground. Now, this isn't the only time that Cappadocius called his clan. He also called on the Feast of Folly, which he called about half of his members of the clan. Lazarus actually broke from the Cappadocians at this time and formed his own splinter group. Basically one of the major bloodlines formed from him, which I will talk about later. But he's managed to find a way to stay in Egypt and stay out of the Setis, the followers of Set's radar, and keep safe there. And using that, he avoided basically the wrath of Cappadocius for basically saying no to going there, and, survived the Feast of Folly. But this isn't the only problem, though. Now Cappadocius turned to the scholars of mortal world in hopes to find more information, to expand their knowledge. And they turned towards the Venetian necromancers, the Giovanni, and Giovanni himself. And here comes the greatest mistake that Cappadocius ever did, embracing Giovanni. It led to their downfall in 1444, where Cappadocius himself was diablerized. Now his spirit, of course, was not diablerized, something a little different than normal, and would go on to cause some problems later. But for now, the clan was basically facing extinction and doom. Now when we come to the Victorian Age, the Giovanni hunted down the Cappadocians. They hunted them to near extinction, and a deal that they had made with the Camarilla prevented them from interfering. We only saw certain groups surviving. Lazarus's group in Egypt survived, forming its own bloodline. There were a number of smaller groups that actually began to mutate and form into some of the bloodlines we know of today, that were formed during this time period, as the main Cappadocian line was basically severed. It basically was fracturing into bloodlines, with the Giovanni being their own version of a bloodline itself, now becoming a clan. But this doesn't mean that the Cappadocians were silently into the night. Beyond the shroud, in death, there were a number of Cappadocians in the realm of the dead, waiting to return and basically get their revenge upon the Giovanni. In the modern nights, we saw some of this. A group of ancient, powerful Cappadocians used the sixth great maelstrom to basically break the shroud and return to the world of the living. Now, the exact process that actually happened, up for debate. But they became known as the Harbingers of Skulls. And they sort of did an allegiance with the Sabbat, because not necessarily they wanted to follow with the Sabbat, but they also hated the Camarilla, which did nothing to save them. So see, enemy of my enemy is my friend. But this isn't the only sign of the Cappadocians themselves. There are throwbacks. There's the one group of Giovanni, which I talked about, the ones that they keep kind of in tunnels and keep away. Also, there are a number of the family of the Giovanni which are being born not with the normal curse of the Giovanni, but with the countenance of the Cappadocians. So you can see a resurgence of their bloodline. This is also to say that they aren't extinct, actually. There are a number of Cappadocians which have survived to the modern day. Angelique and Apatia survive. Now, really, they only have one clan variant we can talk about, but several bloodlines. The clan variant is the Qualia al-mawt, basically the Islamic version of the Cappadocians. Because of some of the Islamic beliefs, they were very careful in the way that they handled the dead and handled their study of the dead. They had to be extra careful. And this is also to say that most of them weren't really true Muslims. They basically followed some of the Islamic tenets, similar to what they did with Christianity. They sort of were following them. Not as bad as some of the other clans which turned towards religion, but they themselves still used the parts of it that kept them what they wanted the best. Unfortunately, they too did fall during the purge of the Giovanni, so this portion of the clan is extinct too. Now, as for the bloodlines, there are 5 bloodlines that we can actually talk about. We've talked about the Giovanni, but there are 4 more, which I will go over in kind, because they have pretty much splintered off into their own thing. Bloodlines are being treated separately than variants, and I will talk about them in the future. Now, when it came to organization, the Cappadocians were very collegial in their organization. They basically were friendly to each other, kind of got along, but they were very solitary in their work. At most, they would get along with, sire and child, and those were the most relationships many of them would have. They were all based upon this idea of studying death and life and unlife. And the fact is that power and prestige within the clan weren't really revolving around age or anything. It revolved around the fact that they had the best knowledge of unlife and death. Those that were the most knowledgeable there got the most prestige within the clan. Now, as a clan, they always pushed forth their own goals. This means they ignored a lot of the politics of the rest of the vampire world. They cared not of Gehenna. They cared not of the bickering or power struggles. They only cared about the goals that they themselves as a clan had, which all revolved around this study. They were kind of passive because of this. And they did have an unusually active antediluvian that basically got in with a lot of the information and assisted them in a lot of ways. So you can see the connections that they had, the power that they had with all of this sort of setup. But the way that they did things made them easy targets for the Giovanni, and is one of the reasons that they fell. Now, they did have long-standing allegiances with the Ventru when they were active. Basically, a lot of princes would have a advisor that was a Cappadocian because they were so sagely and knowledgeable that they'd be at their side. This is a way that they could sort of keep in with vampire society while still keeping to themselves. Your sage is going to do a lot of research on his own and doesn't necessarily need to be bothered with everything. They were also known for adapting Christian religion. And this is actually, in fact, is very interesting because even the elders that were born before Christianity did adapt a lot of the practices. Because Cappadocius himself was a priest and adopted the Christianity, many of them look to this. So you can see many of them would be, in fact, priests or in very similar religious positions whenever they would exist. Now, more often than not, they would embrace from the scholarly or the educated into the clan. Now, one of the interesting things that a newly, basically, reborn Cappadocian would have to go through is they would usually bury them underground or lock them in a crypt, basically for some time soon after they've been embraced, for them to get an idea of death and familiarize themselves with it, basically to adapt them to feelings of death, desensitize them to the problems with it. Now, there have, of course, been multiple versions of it. Effectively, what had happened was the Cappadocians weren't truly formed until Vampire the Dark Ages came out, which occurred after the original Giovanni were already created. So some of the earlier works based around Giovanni didn't really mention the Cappadocians by name, perhaps. They actually talked about certain Giovanni which were actually Cappadocians. It wasn't until after then that the Cappadocians formed. So you can see there's this problem that they're coming. It's basically the chicken's rolling around and all of a sudden the egg he hatched in shows up. That's kind of weird. It's a reversal. It's not the same kind of thing as chicken and egg, but still. And you can see that that's why there have been some problems with the Cappadocians and the way that they were designed. Now, when we move into both the 20th anniversary of Vampire and the 20th anniversary of Dark Ages Vampire, we can see that the Cappadocians have been a little bit more streamlined, and we can see that their discipline of Mortis has been recombined with the parent discipline of Necromancy. And basically, it's now a version, a subset of Necromancy, rather being something else on its own. So that's it for today. I introduced you to the Cappadocians, the Clan of Death, a clan nearly driven to extinction. Very few true Cappadocians remain, but their legacy is actually very powerful. Many bloodlines exist, splintering out from this original clan into various groups, including the powerful Giovanni, which I talked about before. Giovanni himself deoperized Cappadocius, the antediluvian. Didn't get rid of completely. Didn't get all of his powers. And it's one of the reasons that the Giovanni just can't quite get a break in the modern knights, is they didn't quite succeed. Because, of course, the Clan of Death is hard to deal with. And they should have known that when they started tangling with them. Yes, their necromancy fit with the Cappadocians' necromancy, but the Cappadocians are just hard to keep down. Some of them have been known to return from the Veil of Death and find new bodies, because they seek revenge against the Giovanni, harbingers of skulls. So you can see that the Cappadocians are an interesting group. Powerful, and, though, not around in the same way anymore. Again, some members remain, but so few. Handfuls. Maybe even only 2. Regardless, if you have any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It should support the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon. Link description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.